Good morning. I'm Camilla Blaine, and we're doing an in-depth study on Exodus. And we're in chapter 4. But we have some people here today that were not here for chapter 3. So I'm just going to do some highlights of chapter 3 for you. This is when Moses is on the mount called the Mount of God. And it's called Horeb in some places, and it's called Sinai in some places, but it is the same mountain. It is on the Sinai Peninsula. He has gone from Egypt into Midian, but he's on the other side of this slough called Akava. You know, you have the Suez on one side of the, and he's on the other side of it, and there's where he met Jethro, his father-in-law, and he met the girls and married one of them, Zipporah, whose name means little bird. Aww. So do you remember we had a ladybird Johnson? Wow, Zipporah winds up being the ladybird of the Old Testament. It's a nice little thing to know. But anyway, he's gone across, and he's on the Sinai Peninsula instead of on the other side in the Saudi Arabian desert, and he is over there with all the sheep. Probably has several thousand, if I had to guess. And this is where he sees the burning bush. And he takes a double take, and he decides he's going to go check this bush out. And it says, and God, the angel of the Lord. This is actually Jesus, the pre-incarnate Jesus. This is before he became known as Jesus in the New Testament, but this is the Son of God, okay? Sometimes he is called God, and sometimes he is called the angel of the Lord. And he has shown up several places. That's exactly who wrestled with Jacob and broke his, gave him some sort of a hip injury. And he has shown up in many places, and already. But in Genesis, he showed up in a number of places, and now he's showing up to Moses. Okay, so he says, don't come near it without taking off your shoes, because this is holy ground. And you would think that Moses would recognize this as supernatural, that he knew court procedures, and you didn't approach a dignitary without having the proper attitude and dress and so forth. But God reminded him real quickly. Real quickly. So he's having this conversation, and we open chapter 4 with, I think it's the word and or now, which is it? Which which means this is an absolute continuation of chapter 3. I mean, we don't even have, and then it came to pass. I mean, this is the next sentence. Okay, so we're in chapter 4, and let me say these little things before. They're not so much as a summary of where we are, but an intro to chapter 4. Okay, Moses is being given his call. He's in the process. Okay, and his job is to deliver his people out of Egypt, so that they can go to this land of milk and honey that is known as Canaan, which is the Holy Lands, which is the land that God intended for them to have, but it was occupied. And they named 5 different nations who are, 5 different nations who are in that land, even at this time. And they have to be overcome. Okay. So, what we're talking about here in chapter 4 is just a continuation of that same calling. It's just saying it and gets a little bit more detailed, okay? And it begins with Moses' objections. Now, this seems weird because back in chapter 2, was it? He killed an Egyptian because he was abusing one of the Hebrews, and he didn't understand why the Hebrews didn't see him as the deliverer, because he was in the right place at the right time, but he had to flee, because then not only were the Egyptians after him, but the Hebrews wouldn't give him any kind of sanctuary. So he left and went to Midian. All right, so now this is 40 years later. 40 years after he left. And we have the benefit of knowing Moses from hindsight, from what the Bible's given us, and we can deal with a lot of these things with a knowledge that he didn't have. But he's saying, but I can't do this, I'm not good at that, and all that sort of stuff. And so we know he was born, he was saved from death to do this job. We know that because Scripture tells us that, but Scripture wasn't written. He's writing his own.
That's right.
He's writing his own right now. So, although we know he is born for this job, all his life he's groomed for this job, and no one on earth is more qualified to do this job, and all of a sudden he says, but. And he has all kinds of objections. And what we're going to try to find out, is this just humility, or is this more of a false humility? Because not all humility is genuine. It is, if I said to you, I don't know how to teach, you would think, I'm not really telling the truth, am I? I am just, that's false humility, because I can teach because God's enabled me to. Okay? Alright. That's where Moses is. He's saying I can't, even though God is going to say, I'm with you. How can you not if I'm with you? Alright. So let's read the first 2 verses, please, of chapter 4.
Okay. And Moses answered and said, but, behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say that the Lord hath not appeared unto thee. And the Lord said unto him, what is that in thine hand? And he said, a rod.
Okay, so now I've got my Bible right here, and I've got my notes right here, and I've got a copy of my Bible right here, so I can get this up close where I can see it. How's that?
Okay.
All right. So, in the days to come, Moses would use that rod in many different ways. Okay. It would become, by the time we're in verse, or I think 18 of this chapter, it's going to become his badge of authority. It is not just a rod, but it's an ordinary rod. He's been using it, carrying it with him. It is nothing extraordinary except when it's being used by God. Okay. It signifies, because he does magic with it, miracles with it, it's going to become his physical representation of God that's in his hand. It stands for God is with me if I have this wrong. Alright. Wolfer and Zuck say, notice that it is just a rod at this point. And notice the way that God deals with his objections. These very first objections he deals very patiently and gently with Moses' apprehensions. That's important because the tone is going to change. The tone is going to change. And Worsby says, when it says in verse 1, they will not believe me, he's really saying, I don't believe it. That's what I mean, we have to read between the lines here because we're trying to find his real heart.
I don't believe.
Yes, that's exactly right. They're not going to believe because I don't believe. Now try verse 3, please.
Okay. And he said, cast it on the ground. And he cast it onto the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from before it.
Okay, there's some very interesting things here. Note that there's no power in the rod itself.
Right.
It is simply a piece of wood. It's just an instrument that can be used. And it is not, it can be used by Satan or it can be used by God. Alright? We have a whole lot of things in our lives that are like that. That are, we call them amoral. They're neither good nor bad. Money is one of them that we talked about it at length in church. Money can be used for good. It can be used for all kinds of bad things. The internet, it can be used for all kinds of good, and it can be used for all kinds of bad. And now we're facing a new one called AI, and it's like the potential for bad is just extreme, but the potential for good is extreme. So it all depends upon in whose hands it is.
That's true.
And so,
I just want to note to know the same can be said of us.
oh yes, oh yes, we
have
are.
just as much evil in us as we do
do good, and we can
Yeah.
do just as much evil as we can do good. It depends on whether we're in God's hands or not.
Exactly. So we have to be very careful, especially, and that's why I get so emotional when I ask about teaching this, is because I don't want to be an instrument of misinformation.
Exactly.
I don't want to be an instrument of anything that is untrue, and there's a lot of you can't say there's not influence, personal influence on what I say, because this is the points that I bring up.
That's right.
I'm not bringing up everything, so some of it will be just confusing. So I'm weeding it all out, and in the process, I'm putting my own stamp on it, and I always want that stamp to be in the right direction, and I can only say that I use good conservative opinions. They don't always agree, but nonetheless, they're things that I choose to emphasize, and some of them they don't catch. Okay. 4 and 5, please.
And the Lord said unto Moses, put forth thine hand, and take it by the tail. And he put forth his hand, and he caught it, and it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, hath appeared unto thee.
Okay, it's notice there's going to be an extreme pointedness on this is not just a God. This is the God. He's not just the God of Abraham, because all of Ishmael's descendants are going to say, the father of Abraham. You know, the God of Abraham. Well, no. This is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It cannot be partitioned off at any point. We have to go through the patriarchal line, and this is the line that leads to the birth of Jesus.
Right.
Genetically, it is. And so every time it's mentioned, it's not going to say the God. It's not going to say the God of Abraham. It's going to say the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So we need to keep that in mind. But notice in verse 3 how he was afraid of the snake and he ran from it. Now, to the Egyptians, the snake was it represented power. And well, let me read from it. He was afraid of the snake, but that was part of the Egyptian culture, to be afraid of snakes because of what they represented. So for him to reach and grab it at any place, but by the tail, would you grab a snake by the tail, Rosemary?
No.
Would you grab it by the head?
Yes, behind the head.
Yes, behind the head. You would try to grab it, of course not with your fingers. You would do this by a loop that you put over his head, got his head through, and you would grab it, and then you have control over the snake. If you grab that snake in the same fashion, behind the tail, he could, depending on how long he is, and how long your stick is, he can still get you. This is not a safe place. And so imagine the faith and the courage it took to follow God's instructions here and grab him by the tail. And when he does, it becomes a rod. That is faith in action. That is faith in action. And to do that would be a sign, a proof to the elders. He's going to do this in front of the Israelites, and especially the elders, and it's going to be a proof, a sign that he is from God, and he is sending Moses to them, and they can believe that he's supposed to deliver them. Chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, please.
Okay. And the Lord said furthermore unto him, Put now thine hand into the bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous as snow. And he said, Put thine hand into thy bosom again. And he put his hand into his bosom again, and plucked it out of his bosom. And behold, it was turned again as his other flesh.
All right. This second miracle is to prove to Moses himself, and eventually to the people of Israel and the Pharaoh, the Egyptians. Only God can do this. Okay, so he puts his hand, and the bosom here speaks of the inner life. And so Proverbs 4 verse 23 says, Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. So when he pulls his hand out, it is saying, there's no good in me. This is all corrupt. Okay. There were several diseases that were signified by white stuff. by white. And I have seen one critter in Guatemala. It was some sort of an insect, and it was all covered in this. I have no idea whether it was a fungi or whatever it is, but you could see it was like snowy, it's up and all around it. Well, there were several things in Egypt that were like that. Even buildings could be defiled by it. Animals could be defiled by it, and it was a corruption of some sort. And so they weren't all leprous, but they had that same quality of showing this is corrupt. And the message to Moses was the body, our hearts, your inner self is corrupt. And when he puts it in the second time, it comes out clean. God can change our inner being from corrupt to pure. And that's what he's trying to signify here. Okay, so it's deeper than just the idea, oh yeah, well, God can do some stuff like that. This is all significant. And it's significant to the Egyptians for that same reason, because they had whole structures. They knew this was incurable. The fact that it could be cured spoke very, very well of the power of God. And that was one of the things he said, they may believe this more than they believe the rock. They're more likely to believe this. Okay. The conclusion that I came to on this is, don't miss the point. Our inner selves are corrupt, but yielded to God, they become clean and pure. Matthew Henry, my old man, says the hand, the bosom, the leprosy signified, one, that Moses, by the power of God, should bring sore diseases upon Egypt. It means he had the power to bring disease on Egypt, and that at his prayer they should all be removed. Now, this was something that was going to be a story to Egypt. My God has that power. Okay. And that whereas the Israelites in Egypt had become leprous, okay, it doesn't say they followed idolatry, but at the same time they have lived 430 years at this point in Egypt. There's no way that they're not corrupt in some way. That's just, we couldn't live next door to idolatry. Yes. Yes. And so this was a sign to Israel. I can make you poor. And number 3, that Moses was not working these miracles on his own power. Okay. Verse 9, please.
Verse 9. And it shall come to pass, if they will not believe also these 2 signs, neither hearken unto thy voice, that thou shalt take of the water of the river, and pour it onto the dry land, and the water which thou takest out of the river shall become blood upon the dry land.
Okay, so when it says, and it shall come to pass, this is saying there's going to be a time here. And so what I'm speaking about is in the future.
Right.
Okay, so they're not going to believe these other signs. The Egyptians are not, the Pharaoh in particular. And so you're going to draw water, and this is out of the Nile River, which they revered as their source of life. Everything good that happened, everything about Egypt is built on the Nile. So when he takes the water and he pours it out on dry land, but it's blood, that is going to speak powerfully to the Egyptians. Wolford and Zuck. God had apparently not appeared to the Israelites for 430 years, the length of the sojourn in Egypt. The Lord's answer to the doubtful deliverer, who was that? Who's the deliverer? Moses. Was to enable Moses to perform 3 supernatural tasks, 2 immediate miracles that he could do, and 1 for the future. He's telling him about it now, but he's not doing it now because he's not on the Nile River. He's not taking
Not
just
there yet.
yeah, he's not there. So Moses was raised Egyptian, and that's why he was fearful of the snake. That first one is the rod turning to the snake and back, and the snake itself symbolizes power and life to the Egyptians. So that's why Moses was fearful. The second was the hand becoming leprous and healing. And this disease, though perhaps not the same as what we call leprosy today, was prevalent. It was very, it abounded. It abounded. And so this was a very effective sign to the people. And third, to turn the water of the Nile to blood. Egyptians regarded the Nile River as the source of life and productivity. Their whole country's based just on that narrow valley. And so Moses was showing the people, his people, and the Egyptian, that he had power over the Nile River. And that would prove that God had given Moses the ability to overcome the Egyptians. So he wanted everyone to know that this was God that was doing it, but he had authorized Moses. MacDonald says, and MacDonald is the one that just makes nice conclusions. He just sums it up. He says, maybe the disillusionment of Moses in chapter 2, 11 through 15. You remember what happened at that time? This is when he killed the Egyptian, and nobody recognized him as a deliverer. And he's saying, perhaps this had disillusioned him and eaten into his own soul.
Right.
And therefore, God gave him, Moses, these 3 signs to confirm his divine commission. And these signs were designed to convince the people of Israel that Moses was sent by God. They spoke of God's power over Satan, the serpent, God's power over sin, the leprosy, and the fact that Israel would be redeemed from both of these through blood. Yes. So it all gets, you can find all kinds of things.
See the dots.
See the dots. They're all connecting. Okay, verses 10 through 13, please.
Okay. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. And the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb or deaf, or the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. And he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send.
Okay, do you notice the different tone of God's response? What do you mean, doubting me? Who made your mouth?
Exactly.
Who made the ears that are going to hear this? He is already showing impatience with Moses' reluctance. Okay? And Moses is saying, well, I'm not eloquent, well, you know, I'm slow of tongue, and as if he had some sort of impediment. But when we get to the New Testament, in Acts 7 verse 22, Stephen says he was a powerful speaker. And when we stop and think about it, was any apostle or any of Jesus' disciples eloquent? They were just ordinary people, many of them fishermen. They are not eloquent till God produces and works that mouth. So this is just an excuse, okay? Worsby says Moses completely missed the point. The message is God's name and God's miraculous power. And Moses was making the mistake of looking at himself instead of looking to God. And so you say, and now you're doubting God. Now that's what you're saying. When you says I can't, or you're saying I don't want to, and you are speaking in a different thing altogether. You're saying, well, God, you say I can do this, but are you really that powerful, you know? Yeah, you're really doubting God, and there's more to it than that. You're winding up disobedient. Yeah, we'll come to that a little. So, apparently Moses is just downplaying his abilities. But Stephen says, hey, that's just an excuse. Because when Moses suggested God get a replacement in verse 13, we haven't gotten, oh yeah, we did get there. God became angry. Notice that is the next verse, the first line. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. So why? Well, it's probably because God has already perceived that he's speaking more out of disobedience than he is out of fear. Worsby keeps going back to this pride versus humility. He says, was Moses manifesting an attitude of pride or true humility? Because 40 years earlier, he felt perfectly capable to face the enemy and act on behalf of his people. But now he's backing off and professing himself to be a worthless failure. But humility isn't thinking poorly of ourselves. It is simply not thinking of ourselves and thinking about making all about God. Moses was clothing his pride and unbelief in a hollow confession of weakness. And notice in verse 13 that Moses refers to him as Lord. He said, "O Lord," and yet he's denying him what he asks. Now that speaks to disability. If your boss says, we don't have a Lord other than God, but if you have a boss, that's the closest something, someone that has authority over you, or a policeman or something of that nature, and you say, but the first thing, you're denying their authority, and you are becoming disobedient. If you've ever watched the show On Patrol Live or Cops or anything like that, that's the first thing you see. Everyone who starts, well, why'd you stop me? They want to go on the offensive. Nobody wants to be, here I am, what do you want me to do? How high do you want me to jump? Where do you want me to sit? Where do you want my hands? They're all being defensive, and they do it by being aggressive, and they're called red-handed. Oh, that's not mine. Well, yeah, that's my purse, but what's in it's not mine. I mean, it's just, And so you can see that if you're looking deep enough, you see that in what Moses is saying. Oh my Lord, send, I pray, by the hand of him who thou wilt send. Send somebody else. Yeah. So I Googled a definition of humility versus self-esteem. Now, on the surface, they appear to be very similar, but according to the Google research and who knows AI, yeah, their definition says humility has to be what importance we hold of ourselves, whereas self-esteem is what worth we feel of ourselves. And worth and power, authority are two different things. They are. So it's not just having low self-esteem. And okay. Perhaps we need to think more about God as a commander-in-chief. And our only response to anything he says is, sir, yes, sir. How high do I jump?
Exactly.
That it is not just, well, can I argue with you about how I go about this? All right. So, Matthew Henry, my old man, says, Moses still continues backward to the service for which God had designed him. And now we can no longer impute his objections to his humility and modesty. But we must, when we're interpreting this, own that there was much too much of cowardice, slothfulness, and most of all, unbelief. Christ's disciples were not orators, till the Spirit made them such. Verses 14 through 16, please.
Okay. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well, and also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee, and when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. And thou shalt speak unto him, and put words in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth, and with his mouth, and will teach you what ye shall do. And he said, Shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be in him instead of God.
Okay. Does that make sense?
Let's see if that's simpler to understand.
Okay. All right. McGee says, Moses is making a great mistake in asking God for a spokesman. God allowed it, but he did not want to have a divided command.
Right.
And when you get someone else involved, even if they're supposed to be the second in charge, guess what? And we know this happened because we know about the golden calf. Moses gets out of sight, they don't expect him back, and all of a sudden, Aaron is doing all these things. So he was involved in making that golden calf and other difficulties to Moses in his leadership. That wasn't the only time. He questioned Moses' leadership. Worsby says, Aaron and his sister Miriam, okay, she was instrumental in seeing that he was saved as a baby, were critical of Moses and his wife and brought trouble to the camp. Now, this is while they're in the wilderness, so they're camping out for 40 years, okay? And we know that that's in Numbers, chapter 12. One of the most painful judgments God can give us is letting us have our own way. The lesson is plain. God knows us better than we know ourselves. So we must trust Him and obey what He tells us to do without asking, oh, can we do it this way? Can we? And MacDonald's summary on this is, because Moses was not satisfied with God's best, he had to take God's second best, and that is having Aaron as a spokesman. Okay. Verses 17 and 18, please.
And thou shalt take this rod in thy hand, wherewith thou shalt do signs. And Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said unto him, Let me go, I pray thee, and return unto my brethren which are in Egypt, and see whether they be yet alive. And Jethro said to Moses, Go in peace.
Okay. We have a timeline here that gets kind of, we're having to read between the lines, okay? Do you have this map? Yeah, I passed it out weeks ago. And I
gave for one the last time we were here.
okay, well, I've got some larger copies, but I don't think they're going to show up as well as this one.
Yeah, the little one does.
The little one is going to show up better for the camera. Okay, you see the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, and you see that waterway there. This is the Aqaba.
Hers is not up high enough.
No, it's not up enough. Oh, now your face is gone, but
Well, that's all right. I want this. Okay, so this side over here by Egypt is the Suez, and it became a canal that went all the way to the Mediterranean. This other side is Aqaba. All right. Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, is right in the middle of that peninsula. Okay? But his father-in-law's camp is on the other side. So he's here. He's going to go to Egypt up here, but he's got to go back there first. He's got a whole bunch of sheep. Now he's going to ask for his father-in-law's blessing. And then he has to come back right by that mountain again. All right, does that make sense? He's got to go east
come back west.
to go back west. All right. In the meantime, either Aaron on his own or by God's direction has already started on his way from Egypt. But a lot happens between the time that right here and when he meets on the same mountain. He's going to make a round trip to the east, and Aaron's going to come from the west. Okay. Matthew Henry says, now don't forget the rod. This is your sword. This is your scepter. This is your authority, and it becomes the staff of God. In verse 20, we're not quite there yet. Okay, so now we've got this map, and we're going, I've already explained that. All right. We're just starting this timeline that's going to take Moses to the east, and Aaron is coming. So they're going like this, as it turns out, but he comes back and they meet right at the same spot. Okay, verse 19, one verse.
And the Lord said unto Moses in Midian, Go, return into Egypt, for all of the men are dead which sought thy life.
Okay, so Wolfman's say that was Tutmos the third, who was the Pharaoh that was trying to kill you. He's dead, and now we have Amenhotep the second, and so all the people that 40 years have gone, all those people are gone, so you don't have any fear of returning to Egypt with your family. With your family. Verse 20, please.
And Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand.
Okay, and it says past tense, he returned, but he's not there. Okay, we've got a lot that happens between now and the time he gets there. So this, in my opinion, is more correctly interpreted. He's on his way. He's returning. He just hasn't fully returned.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And he has his wife, Zipporah is her name, his firstborn son, whose name is Gershom, and we know this from verse 22 of chapter 2, and his second son, Eleazar, who's not named until chapter 18, verse 4. Now, Wolfer and Zuck say, now perhaps Eleazar was born after God appeared to Moses in the beginning of chapter 3. When Moses had returned to Jethro, then he meets his son for the first time. He may have been born, but he's young. Okay, he's young. But something is going to happen here, and I'm trying to give you a heads up so you know for sure. This becomes important because this son is not circumcised. He's not circumcised at the time of his birth, and he is not circumcised by the time Moses leaves to return. And God has already sent Aaron on his way. So now we're taking a child, and this is going to be the problem. Okay? Verses 21, 22, and 23, please.
Okay. And the Lord said unto Moses, when thou goest to return into Egypt, see that thou do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in thy hand. But I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, thus said the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I said unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn.
Okay. He's not in Egypt. God's already told him this. He's just telling him again. This is encouragement. Now, whether this is in some vision, whether it's audible to his wife and children, that we do not know. But what we do know is God is coaching him, encouraging him all the way. It is more than just, I've sent you on your way, and now go. You know,
That's right.
he is encouraging him on the way. Verse 24.
And it came to pass by the way in the inn, that the Lord met him and sought to kill him.
Oh my. Oh my. He's on his way. He's got his wife and sons with him. He's staying in an inn. They're occupied. They're traveling by. He's put just his wife, it appears, just his wife and children on the ass. And the Lord appears to him and tries to kill him. He's trying to get his attention. somehow or another he incapacitates Moses. Now, whether this is with an illness, paralysis, whatever the deal is, it appears that if Zipporah doesn't act, Moses is going to die. That's what it appears. Because he sought to kill him. And that's not just strike him sick. This is something that requires attention. Well, I don't know whether Moses could communicate in this time, but between Zipporah finally figures it out that this is the sin of omission. The child has not been circumcised. So read the next verse.
Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, Surely a bloody husband art thou to me.
And one more.
So
Yes.
he let him go. Then she said, A bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision.
Okay. So the background information McGee gives is circumcision was the badge and the seal of God's covenant with Abraham. We're talking thousands of years ago.
3 generations.
Many generations. I mean, it's been 430 years since Jacob. So, I mean, and that was Jacob's grandfather. And they lived a long time. So, this was a very long time ago that covenant was made. And it was designed to teach the Israelites to have no confidence in the flesh.
Right.
That's what it was for. And apparently, Zipporah had resisted the ordinance, and Moses had not insisted. Okay. So, it appears that he's willing to stand up against Pharaoh, but not his wife. Worsby says, we get the impression that when Moses had circumcised Gershom, the older son, Zipporah had been appalled by the ceremony and therefore resisted having Eleazar going through the same circumcision. So she is saying it was a bloody ordeal. I don't see why any child should have to go through this. And she called her husband a bloody husband because of that circumcision and the blood that was produced there. So my summary on this part is that these verses indicate Moses was unable to do this. This would have been the father's job.
Right.
But the women were always there. It was done after their uncleanness was fulfilled. So that's why it was on the 8th day, because they were 7 days. Anyway, so the woman, the mother, was supposed to be there. All right. She realizes that this is the deal. Whether he tells her, you've got to do this, I can't, or whatever the deal was. She was not happy about it. And she called Moses a bloody husband, and that was not meant to be a compliment. That was, so she did it, and it's as if, well, so there, it's bloody well done now. You know, she does it, but because of her obedience in doing it, even regardless of her attitude, God released whatever hold he had, death grip that he had on Moses. And Zipporah and the sons go home. Now, that's not said right here. But she doesn't make it to Egypt. So sometime between now and entering Egypt, she and the boys go home. She's never going to be closer than what she is right now. So it's kind of like, yeah, this is kind of a split point. And she's just saying, you know, I've had enough. I am not going to be a part of stuff like that. And the reason we know that she goes home is because in chapter 18, verses 2 and 3, Jethro returns Zipporah and the two boys to Moses. Again, with his blessing. But it's like they're not in sync right now. And this is over the fact that he is part of the lineage that goes all the way. That his God is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Yeah. So, meanwhile, Aaron's still moving. And I'm sure it took Moses quite a time to get all the sheep back, because he had to return them to his father-in-law and pack up and get the blessing and all that sort of stuff. And then they were stopped in this death grip and circumcision. And now read verses 27 and 28, please.
And the Lord said to Aaron, Go into the wilderness to meet Moses. And he went and met him in the mount of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord who had sent him, and all the signs which he had commanded him.
Now, I marked it over here earlier where it's so frustrating when you know something is there and you just saw it. Oh, okay. In verse 14, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite brother? And he said, Behold, he cometh forth to meet thee, and when he seeth, he will be glad in his heart. So God had called Aaron that time. He already knew this was going to happen, and this is the way it was going to happen, and so now it has happened, and it just so happens their timing is perfect. Guess what? That's the way God planned it. And so it had been over 40 years since they had seen each other, and the Holman footnote says this summary of their meeting and everything parallels the one that's also in chapter 18, verses 8. Okay. Did you read 27, 28?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. 29 through 31, please.
And Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel.
Now notice, they had him returning, but they said he had returned, well, but he hadn't. But now they're there. Now they're there. They've called all the people together.
Right. And Aaron spake all the words which the Lord had spoken unto Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked upon their affliction, then they bowed their heads and worshipped.
So this is a big deal. They have been crying out, moaning, groaning. They're so heavily burdened with labor and taxes and all the sort of stuff under the Egyptians. They didn't know how to get out of it. They knew they couldn't get out of it, and all of a sudden they see that God has visited them, that has seen their affliction, and has called up Moses to deliver them, and right now Aaron is their spokesman. So this is a big, big worship scene. This is huge. Worsby says, this chapter describes 5 encouragements God gave Moses as he sought to obey the will of God. Okay? So this is a summary for the whole. In verse 18, his father-in-law gave him his blessing. Verses 19 through 23, the promises of God. I'll be with you. These are the signs. 24 through 36, Zipporah's obedience, even if it was done in anger. The fourth one, Aaron's arrival, which is verses 27, 28. And then the end of it is 29 through 31, the nation of Israel's faith. But this is the lull before the storm. Because God is going to declare war on Egypt. We hope that's what's happening in Israel. God has declared war on Hamas.
Right.
But anyway, life for the Israelites is going to get worse before it gets better. That's often
That is
the way things are. And that's our lesson for today.